we're honored to have Bobby Wells' presence here today. Bobby is the president of IAWA. So with her busy time, I'm really happy that she keeps on making time to these special networking sessions that we have at least bi-weekly. So Bobby, welcome. And I think maybe you can get us started with some welcoming notes from you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I'm excited to be here. And you might notice behind me that I am in a hotel. I'm actually at the Charleston Hotel for our annual conference in October of this year. So I'd like to ask everybody to mark their calendars for October 13th, 14th, and 15th to come to historic Charleston and join us for our opportunity to gather everybody back together, finally, post-COVID, hopefully, and celebrate not only the revival of aviation, but our opportunity to connect with one another in person once again.
Thanks a lot, Bobby. As usual, running around for IAWA on top of your important role at FedEx, and what you do for the industry is really amazing. Well, I think we have a couple of people that are here, so I'll just get started. As I mentioned, I'm Sophie Gazay, the VP of events for IAWA. I'm here in Washington, DC. I see that we have people from all over the world, and welcome to our global participants today. And thanks for making the time to hear from our global aviation law expert and founder of International Aerospace Law and Policy Group, Joe. Believe it or not, it's 1 a.m. where he's at. He's presenting for us from Australia. So Joe, we're honored to have you, and I don't want to take it away from you. You're going to be telling us about yourself first. And this session is going to be about 30 to 45 minutes where Joe would be talking about his experience. And it's so diverse, I don't even want to get into what he does. He'll tell us all his roles in aviation law. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it on the chat. And at the end, I'll read it to him. And then we'll also have an opportunity to have a live Q&A session as well. And without further ado, Joe, I'll pass it to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. And I'd like to acknowledge Bobby. Thank you very much to IAWA, to Adoli, actually, for introducing me to IAWA, for Sophie and Denise to facilitate this great opportunity to talk to you about some of the weird and wonderful things that I, as an aviation lawyer, in inverted commas, do on a day-to-day basis and have done in the last 6 years with this niche law firm that we've set up here in Brisbane, Australia. What I'd like to do is just share my screen with you, if I can do that briefly. I've got a bit of a PowerPoint to guide the discussion, introduce myself, the practice, how we came about, what we do, why we do it, and talk about what the future holds for us as a firm. As Sophie said, I'll probably talk for about half an hour. I'll resist the urge that lawyers have to talk on and drone on, especially about themselves, as best I can, and leave opportunity for you to ask any questions you like about this practice in the law and policy and what we do. So as you can see, our firm is called International Aerospace Law and Policy Group. It's a bit of a mouthful because I wanted to have a niche aviation practice in law, but I also wanted to be an advocate, partially a think tank to advance aviation safety. So that's what the policy group is all about. There are basically two businesses within the group. There is the law firm, which also goes by the name of Australia's Air and Space Lawyers, and the newer company, America's Air and Space Mediators. And I'll tell you a bit more about all of these as we go along. But here is basically our vision. What we want to do is provide aviation legal expertise to passengers and the aviation community cost effectively, and in doing so make aviation safer. And we make it safer through our case and client selection and advocacy. So as I like to tell our staff and new clients, there's a silver thread that runs through our practice, and that is we won't take a client on, even a well-heeled, well-paying client, if taking their case on means a threat to air safety in some way, shape or form. And I'll talk about the practice areas we handle, but if, for example, we have a pilot who comes to us with a dispute with their regulator about their medical certificate, if I'm not willing to put myself and my family on the plane with them, then there's no way we're going to be advocating for them because it's against their own interests and it's against the interests of aviation safety. So we'd much rather take on a pro bono case where someone was hard done by in a regulatory decision that affects their flying than a well-heeled client who just wants to push the boundaries and really has no place in the air. So it's not really a judgment from us, it's really just the theme and the values that we have. We just want the system to be safer, and we realize that everyone in the aviation community has some contribution to make to that, and that's ours. So, pardon me, you probably don't know much about me. I'll give you a potted history of how I came to be an aviation lawyer. I grew up actually wanting to be a computer programmer, and I was very interested in science. However, I ended up in law school because my attempts at university to toy with numbers and science backfired significantly. And I discovered my talents were more in relation to words than numbers. So after a dismal attempt at computer science, I entered law school, but wasn't really quite satisfied with even that. I mean, I enjoyed the problems of law, but I developed an interest in flying while I was at law school. And that really, really led me down a path of thinking, well, I could use this application in the law passionately because I was so interested in reading about the rules of flight and about litigation in aviation, which to me was so fascinating because of the kinds of factual scenarios that occurred, but also because the scenarios were international in application. I really enjoyed the idea of learning about international law and the fact that aviation law was transportable itself. And I thought it would be hopefully an opportunity to see the world, and it has provided that to me. So I completed my law degree in Western Australia, and during that time I had no opportunities to learn aviation law in Australia. So through conferences and associations similar to IAWA, the Aviation Law Association in Australia, I was privileged to meet some aviation practitioners from the United States, strike up a relationship with them to be able to intern at firms in the US. And so I was able to go to Kreindler and Kreindler in New York, which is a historically fantastic plaintiff aviation firm, and Condon and Forsyth in California to learn about the defense and insurance side of aviation crash litigation, specifically to see it from both sides. And that was a fantastic experience, and it led me to want to do further study. So after I became a practitioner in Australia, I worked for 2 years and then went to McGill University in Montreal and did the graduate certificate in Air and Space Law, which was also an incredible opportunity to meet people around the world also as passionate about aviation and the legal side of it as I was, and I really enjoyed that. So I completed that in 2011, came back to Australia and worked for our Australian government as a airport regulator and policy officer in Canberra, which was a great opportunity to see what the law was like in the agencies where it was made, essentially, which for a lawyer is unusual. You don't usually do anything but interpret the law, apply the law, and argue the law. You don't see about the interesting aspects of it being made and behind the scenes. That was really interesting for me. I'm admitted to courts in Australia, New Zealand, and pro hac vice, which means for specific cases, to courts in Illinois. And they're set out on the screen there. Yep, I mentioned that I've had this policy experience. After working in the government, I worked for some private law firms and helped set up the aviation plaintiff litigation practices in Australia. So Shine Lawyers and Morris Blackburn Lawyers, which led up to about 2015, which is when I began my practice, International Aerospace Law and Policy Group, or IALPG for short. In the time since then, I've had a few representative roles, including for IALPA, where I was the past vice chair of their legal committee, which involved delegations to the ICAO legal committee and certain task forces on particular subjects in the interest of airline pilots. I've also got voluntary roles working for the HIMSS Australia Advisory Group, which is in the US, pilots may be familiar with the FAA HIMSS program, which is a program to assist addicted, substance and alcohol addicted pilots get their medical certificates back after a diagnosis of substance use disorder and recover so they can save their lives and their careers. And I've been working with a team of passionate pilots in Australia for the last 5 to 6 years to create a voluntary program like that in Australia. And that falls under the HIMSS Australia Advisory Group banner. IALPG, our firm, has some diverse staff and consultants working for it. In the past, we've had Australian naval officers, aviation warfare officers work for us. We have presently a space law expert who is an ex-wing commander in the Royal Australian Air Force. He happens to be from Perth, Western Australia, like me, and we both studied at McGill University at the same time, proving it is a very small world in our community. Our firm has contributed to spacelaws.com, which is the ANGELS program, or Australian Navigational Guide, explaining the laws of space. So this is an encyclopedic summary of basic space law for startups in Australia. And we, as a firm, take on interns and students from around the world, typically for short periods of time, to give them a taste of what our practice is like, what aviation law and our practice areas are like, and they're often remote. Pre-COVID, we had staff and interns from around the world work with us because by its very nature, aviation is international, and so must our practice be. All right, a little bit about the kinds of cases. You must be wondering, what sort of cases do we run as an aviation law firm? And first of all, we assist pilots. And in Australia, we assist pilots with medical disputes that they have about their medical certificates, disciplinary actions, and other regulatory advice. We help drone companies with regulatory advice and representation. Our dispute resolution practice is probably the most diverse element of our practice. So you may be aware that law firms in litigation differentiate themselves either as plaintiff law firms, which means they act for injured individuals or the estates of people who are deceased in accidents, or defendant, which is the insurance side or the companies being sued in legal actions. We are a plaintiff firm, and the history that I have, the most experience I have, is with accident cases for families who have lost their next of kin in aviation accidents around the world. So by way of example, we've acted for families of people from Malaysia in the MH370 disaster, in the MH17 disaster, and we were privileged to represent 38 families of passengers killed in the Fly Dubai 981 737 crash in 2016. The interesting thing about these is there are tenuous connections with Australia, but the families and the law under which these claims are made are often something that we have claims expertise in and work with lawyers from other countries to enable claims to be made in foreign jurisdictions. So in the Fly Dubai case, you have a Dubai-based carrier with claimants, families of the deceased who are from the Ukraine and Russia, seeking advice through us, working with Russian lawyers for cases that were agitated in Russia, but negotiated between myself and the law firms acting for the air carrier and its insurer in Dubai, which was a British firm in Dubai. So it can get complicated, but the number of firms that basically handle claims for airlines in those sorts of circumstances, as you may well know, are very few. You can count them on two hands, basically, and there aren't too many that I haven't worked with on a variety of different types of claims. At the moment, we have some charter accident crash cases we're handling for people who were injured in Vanuatu, and some smaller light aircraft accident cases in Australia. So these cases are in terms of personal injury or death cases. Now, we also have a practice, being international, in relation to economic damages. So the first point there is the Boeing class action we have in relation to the 737 MAX certification issues. So we have about 115 clients, I think at last count, who've signed up from 16 airline groups around the world who've joined a class action against Boeing in relation to the economic losses, financial losses they suffered as a result of allegations we make of fraud by Boeing in the training of the 737 MAX pilots. So that is an action that is being agitated in federal court in Illinois, and which we're working with US counsel on. So that is probably the largest class action that's ever been filed against Boeing. And it's still, due to the COVID delays, in its relatively early stages, but certainly an interesting case with some novel allegations and novel circumstances being made. Everyone will be aware in this group about the 737 MAX and the issues it had and has, which continue, and the history there. We also act for a diverse group of mostly military pilots who are flying instructors deployed on a contract for the UK Ministry of Defence, who have suffered some injuries in their operations. Again, working with foreign counsel, this time in the UK, for actions that have happened in yet another country, this time in the Middle East, but bringing our expertise in claims handling to the situation. As I've already mentioned, we do have cases, aeromedical cases for pilots. That is our day-to-day type of action and dispute resolution for mostly Australian pilots and our regulator here, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. So you might have someone who suffered an accident and been to hospital and lost their Class 1 medical certificate. We would help that pilot negotiate their medical certificate back, negotiate conditions on that medical certificate, or fight an adverse decision in our local tribunals and courts. Finally, we have a newish group of cases that are also being fought in Illinois courts, and they are in relation to fumes, onboard fumes exposures to pilots. So we have four claimants in 3 filed cases against Boeing and some other manufacturers in relation to issues with the bleed air system on various aircraft and injuries that these pilots have suffered from their exposure to the toxic chemicals in cabin air on certain occasions. So that is another interesting, diverse type of case that we're looking at and continue to look at as time goes on. Okay, so this is just a bit about what we focus on. We defend pilots, as I said. We assist with medical certificates. We've developed something of an expertise, I would say, in relation to matters for pilots' medicals when they involve alcohol and substance issues. In addition to my law degree, I've studied psychology and take a keen interest in cognitive aspects of pilot health. So there are a variety of medical issues that have plagued pilots and we've had to deal with and negotiate with regulators about, including alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and a variety of traumas and injuries that are comorbid with those types of issues. And in almost all cases, we've been able to get the pilot back flying once their health is stationary, stable, and they're meeting all the requirements to be fit pilots. All right, so that concludes the little bit about the law firm, Australia's Air and Space Lawyers, or IALPG. Last year during COVID, I saw an opportunity to take this new dynamic of working from home and people working through this medium on Zoom and Skype and what have you, to be able to do more than just advise people, but to help resolve disputes, to help facilitate disputes. So this was a new opportunity for us to take our values in advising clients, pardon me, into the dispute resolution space. So I used some time in lockdown last year to become a nationally accredited mediator under Australia's rules, which is something I've learned I really love to do. And that's help people not only argue their disputes for someone else to make a decision on, but to help them make their own decision about resolving a dispute. It's really a beautiful thing to see parties that are entrenched in their positions find common ground, commonality, understand the sensitivities of the other side, and reach a compromise that works for everyone. It's something I think aviation has needed in a variety of domains within aviation for a long time. And I hope through the new business we've set up under IALPG to be offering that to aviators and their employers and defendant airlines and plaintiffs as time goes on more and more. So why mediate aviation disputes? The disputes that I've dealt with, typically the litigation for crashes and so forth, are protracted, expensive to run, involve a lot of lawyers, and are typically inefficient. This is the nature of the beast. Like any area of litigation or dispute resolution where you have a specialized subject matter like aviation to deal with and experts involved, there's a lot of expense. And really, when you get down to the core of a dispute, there are only a handful of things that stop people from agreeing. And I wanted to find a way where we could reduce that imbalance, as it were, of inefficiencies and somehow get people to agree within the context of a mediator facilitating dispute resolution who knows the lay of the land, who knows how the aviation system works and how parties who have to deal with each other in business and commercial transactions day to day, even during and after disputes, can find common ground and find a way forward. So having an aviation-specific mediator type scenario allows for intra-industry efficiencies for commercial resolutions where a dispute could be protracted and just go through law firms' workflow practice of delaying and pushing forward and fighting on a variety of grounds for no purpose other than to fight. You can cut through that and just allow a commercial resolution and people to get on with what they do best in aviation. What I discovered in dealing with pilot disputes over medical certificates with the regulator was that in dealing with the same adversary over and over again, and I've dealt with the cases of hundreds of pilots in the last decade with the regulator, there were some things that newer lawyers who are not in the practice area would have done that make it inefficient for the regulator and make it inefficient for the pilot and allow things to drag on. So when you have a specialized tribunal or an alternative dispute resolution solution, it allows you to cut to the chase, basically, and put the options on the table and have a useful conversation about moving forward for the pilot and for the regulator. So it's something I put to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority in Australia a few years ago, and we're working on trying to create a more efficient way resolving disputes than going through a litigation type process, specific for the aviation disputes that we deal with. And we think we can cut out a lot of time wastage and money wastage for people by doing that. And this is why I see in aviation the opportunity to have that time wastage and those inefficiencies removed, so we can cut to the chase, allow the aviators to keep flying, the regulators to keep their focus on the dangers that they're supposed to be safeguarding the community and travelling public from, rather than litigation and disputes that can just drag on. The other thing is I just really like the completion of cases. I'm really motivated by completion. I'm very outcome oriented. And when you have a win-win and an elegant solution where both parties are happy to move forward, it's a very intellectually satisfying thing and professionally satisfying thing for me. And I just want to encourage that to as many litigants or people with disputes to resolve as possible. That's really all I wanted to say about me and the practice and the new mediation opportunity that we have in America's Air and Space Mediators. There's been a lot there that I've gone over superficially, of course, but I'd invite your questions now, and we can talk a bit about any aspects you might be interested in, things you may have questions about outside of my practice and what my views might be, with the qualification that I'm not giving legal advice to anyone at this point, but I'm more than happy to have a chat with you about any aspect that comes up that might have been triggered by looking at my presentation there.
I'll start.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Did somebody have a question? Okay, so Joe, sorry. Thanks a lot for an excellent presentation, and I'm really happy to see the broad aviation expertise that you have in law. So you mostly talked about license issues with pilot, like especially when they're in relation to alcohol and drug. But as you know, the flight attendants have license, the mechanics have license, the ground personnel, different divisions have license, and I'm sure there's alcohol and drug related violations with them as well. And now you mentioned drone as well, and drone, there's a license for drone as well. But how do you see, or is there anything, especially drone related license revocation because of substance abuse? And do you work with the other different aviation entities as well, the mechanics and the flight attendants, when it comes to license revocation and reinstitution?
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, absolutely. So where there is a scheme for licensing, certification, where there's government decision-making by regulators, we can assist. So we've helped air traffic controllers with medical issues as well. They have a class 3 medical certificate. And lamies on the ground and so forth. We have a broad network like that, and a lot of the issues are the same. So it's something that we have some experience with handling. You mentioned drones. Definitely in my IALPG work, one of the things I did was lead a legal committee working group on the inclusion of remote pilots and drone pilots into the family of IALPG, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty controversial thing for airline pilots to let anyone into that world, especially, you know, for what many years people thought were glorified remote control hobbyists rather than aviators, or photographers and people from other domains, but not aviators. But clearly, obviously, there are aviation safety matters involved with remotely piloted aircraft. So I led that working group and talked with IALPG about that, and what came out of it was kind of a program of the member associations of IALPG engaging with commercial drone associations in their own jurisdiction and making some avenue of membership for them for the purpose of cross pollination of thought, cross-pollination of policy discussion, so that anyone involved with aviation could get the benefit of the airline pilot's experience, and the drone pilots could get the benefit of that experience in their operations and an understanding of how their actions interact with the aviation environment. There was also a recognition, of course, that as a growing number or proportion of the aviators out there, remote pilots, and the companies who operate these drones commercially are growing in significance. The variety of operations that they undertake and the closeness to conflict with traditional aviation is growing. So it was very important that there be some way to cooperate and know what each other is doing for the future. So yes, one of the roles I had was actually on the management committee of ACUO in Australia, which is the Australian Commercial Drone Operators Association. And what we've done is work together with them, pilot unions who have been my clients in Australia before, to work with our national regulator on things like urban air mobility and future-focused policy on unmanned traffic management, and how that can find itself into Australian policy and Australian law. So this goes to the policy group part of our firm name, and thinking about future problems and how they can be avoided. I mean, sadly, as they say, much of aviation law is written in blood. And so there's no reason that that should be the case with drone regulation into the future, because there is a well put together regulatory system, as you know, a very comprehensive system through the ICAO annexes on regulating international aviation. And that provides a fantastic blueprint for how drone regulation should be approached going forward. So it's a very interesting area. It's an ever-emerging area, and it's always growing intensely complex as the technology grows as well, because you get into hybrid aerospace vehicles and the whole space law component of unmanned aviation as well. But it's something we're really interested and involved with in Australia, at least, and through IALPG I have been in the past.
Great. Thanks for very detailed explanation. Okay, anybody else have any questions?
I think I saw Adoli write a question there.
Yes, so I have a question here, and I'm trying to start my video so you can see me as I talk. So thanks, Joe, for joining us and for sharing all of that useful information. So I have a couple of students on here who had sent me a message on the site to say they're interested in potentially interning with the organization, but wanted to know how that process works. As students, I think a couple of them have gathered together and are using one Zoom link. So there's just one name showing for, and that's Doreen Quanta on there. So I just wanted to ask you to kind of share any information you have about the application process for becoming an intern and what it entails, because just knowing that it can be done virtually, right, is exciting, especially since we're trying to kind of look at increasing diversity within this space. The virtual option gives us that opportunity to spread our wings beyond our physical geographical space. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Adoli. It really gives me an opportunity to say that I know what it's like being interested in a niche field of law, in aviation law, and feeling like there are limited opportunities, and that those opportunities were far away from me. So back when I was a new practitioner, the way that I found I could get involved with and meet practitioners was through associations and their conferences and programs, just like IAWA holds. One of the few things I did was apply for scholarships through the American Bar Association to their tort trial insurance practice section. ABA TIPS is the acronym. They provide scholarship funds for people to go to their aviation legal conferences and I was able to use that to travel from Australia. And once when I was at Montreal to Washington, DC to attend those conferences, and they were great opportunities. But in terms of what I do now, knowing that getting that work experience, which is so important to understand fields of law that one, you may want to get into, but two, get exposure to determine I don't want to get into it, is a really, really difficult thing, but it need not be. So what we do is, because we're such a niche practice area, is we have a rolling intake of interns, typically law students who are seeking certification or admission in their jurisdiction as lawyers in university to become research assistants and interns, often remotely, so they can get an idea of what it takes to do the actual legal research, the legal drafting, and work within a team, an international team that is working towards an aviation safety goal through legal processes. So we don't have a formal program as such. It literally goes by our capacity at any particular period of time. This office where I'm speaking to you from is our base in Brisbane. And at times we've had up to 3 interns at one time. Some of them have been lawyers in training who were current airline pilots on their downtime. We've had law students from interstate in Australia and law students from around the world. And there definitely is an opportunity to do this sort of work remotely. I mean, our firm has naturally and always had to work remotely with people overseas. It's the nature of our practice. And as I like to tell people, you can practice law from the moon as long as it's got Wi-Fi. So I'm more than happy to consider applicants who are interested in aviation law. And they needn't be lawyers as such. They can be aviators who are interested in the regulatory side of aviation and want to get an understanding of how lawyers advise aviators. To just simply write to me, to email me, and to have a chat with me about what they are seeking, and we can probably time an opportunity for them accordingly, just depending on how busy we are and whether we have the capacity to supervise someone at the time or not. Typically over the summer in the Southern Hemisphere here, which is December through to January, February, is the best time. That's when typically the law students here have their long holiday break. And obviously the Northern Hemisphere has its winter, and maybe a good time where students are at home and want to do a little bit of extra work. That's a good time to do that sort of thing. And basically all we do is work by email, work by Zoom, have a chat, assign work, I review work, and you actually get to contribute to real outcomes. We're not the kind of firm that likes to give academic exercises to student interns. I was never given that sort of thing. I was really given substantive work to help with cases. And I think that's the best way to learn. And there's no better way to learn than being thrown in the deep end, as it were. So I remember my internship experience in New York, and the very first day, a meeting with partners of Kreindler and Kreindler. We went to lunch at a Chinese restaurant, and they told me to investigate a federal rule of civil procedure and how it might influence a particular case they were working on. And I hadn't even studied federal rules of civil procedure and commercial practice in Australia. And I walked home that night with my mouth like this, thinking, oh my God, Auntie, how am I going to survive this internship when I don't even know what they're talking about now? But it was the best experience of my life, being made to use my practical research skills to come up with an answer. As it turned out, my answer was wrong, but I learned very quickly how to find the right answer. And you'll have experiences like that, or the students that have worked with us in the past have had those sorts of experiences where they've really learned what are the practical elements you need to take out of the law school environment into the real world of practice. And likewise, the pilots who have worked with us in the past have learned, yep, it's great, I know all about my aviation operations and that way of thinking and decision making, and how different it is from advising another client and all the risks and protections that have to be dealt with in giving someone advice that can affect their life and career. So it's a great opportunity. They always exist. There's no limit except our capacity. So I always invite people who are interested in seeing this sort of practice, learning whether it's for them or not for them, to get involved. And yeah, I'm more than happy to field applications from people who are in that boat.
Joe, do you mind if I share your email on the chat here, or?
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all.
All right.
I see a message
Let
from...
me see if there are any questions here. Yeah.
I've got people from Washington, D.C., Memphis, world. Very cool. Can I just say briefly, thank you to everyone for making time to hear me and what I do. As I said, I could drone on, but I hopefully gave you a bit of a taste about what a specialist practitioner in this area does. And if after the event you'd like to email me and get in touch about any aspect of the kinds of cases I work on, or if you'd like to read some of the public material that's out there in the US court system that we've been involved in, more than happy to give you links and info about that. And you may find something interesting. For example, the 737 MAX issues that are going on and our approach to it. There are many interesting aspects that might be something you'd like to follow going forward, but I'm happy to give you some further info if you require
it. Thank you. Everybody's shy today. Can we get some more questions while we have the opportunity?
Maybe no one understands my Aussie accent. It can be problematic.
Well, I am curious to get an idea what kinds of maybe settlements, options or reliefs some of your clients or some of the parties you work with, are interested in, because I also work in dispute resolution, and it's very interesting to see the types of things people are looking for. When we talk about dispute resolution, often the first thing that comes to mind is the financial award. A lot of people are focused on the financial award, but you would realize that sometimes it's not just the financial award. People want other things other than the financial award. People want support for education. People want a recommendation to move forward in their career. There's so many things, access to facilities, services. So, if you can share some of that with us, just to help us figure out how we can tune our minds into that area as well, because we're always looking at litigation. When there's an issue, people want to go to court to seek reliefs, and then we leave that responsibility in the hands of a judge to determine. But what are some of the things that a mediator can, I guess, secure for parties who submit to mediation, a little different from what maybe you can get from the courts?
Yeah, absolutely, Adoli. It's a very good question. And it's something I've looked at in a philosophical musing sort of sense throughout my practice. And what I've come to discover is, yes, there is the desire for money to resolve disputes by claimants, but it's never the same reason. There is always an emotional need behind the case. And that is strongly culturally driven. That's probably the only single unifying thing I can say in all my experience, is that there is different attitudes and desires for a money settlement based on cultural influences and how money might be used that compensates a loss. So primarily the kinds of money settlements we're talking about are for the death of a passenger who happens to be a breadwinner for a family. So there's no way that money is ever going to compensate that loss of life. quite simply, there are no winners as such in this sort of litigation. All there is a family having the means to move forward in its life, the life of children and their schooling and mortgage payments and what have you, when the main economic breadwinner of a family is gone. So there is, just like I say in family law, no winners in a divorce settlement, for example. People have to move forward with great losses in their lives. But underneath that unifying theme is the emotional need that comes out. So in the MH370 disappearance of the 777 there, I met with many families in China, for example, and in Malaysia, who had a strong, understandable desire for some form of understanding as to what happened. There was just no way for them to culturally, and in some respects, religiously move forward without knowing what happened to their loved ones. And as a lawyer, you are not equipped to help families deal with that. All you can do is listen. And that was really very significant and memorable for me, in that families were asking questions, not about the law, not about compensation, but just wanting answers. So that's something I found. Now, in other cultures, in Russia, for example, there was a very different approach. There wasn't so much the same approach to knowing what happened, but wanting a different, there was a different motivator to get the money, and there was a much different emphasis on getting the money as a way of demonstrating the wrong had been done to their family. So it's difficult for me to find the words to explain these different observations, but yes, everyone will get their money in the end. I can't talk about the amounts involved, they're confidential, of course, but as you can imagine, that money means different things, even though practically it goes to the same sort of use for families who have lost a loved one. So really, I found the best way to deal with it is to be a sounding board and good listener. And I try and listen as best I can when people come to me with their suffering. And uniformly, if people are using a plaintiff aviation lawyer, such as myself, they're not coming to us in happy circumstances. They're coming to us having suffered trauma. And we have a great responsibility to sensitively deal with those people's needs, including if that involves referring them to other professional service providers or medical service providers for counselling and therapy, to be able to guide them through what is a very convoluted and complicated process for someone who's never dealt with the law or never thought they would have to deal with that sort of traumatic loss. So yeah, it's the question of settlement is, it's a big legal question, and the numbers are what the lawyers argue about the most. But in day-to-day interactions with families and clients, it's dealing with, how do you feel today? How is this letter from the other side being experienced by you and your family? It can be extremely traumatic for lawyers too, to vicariously go through the suffering that families have, but we have that professional distance that we need to keep, as you can understand. And yeah, so my observations are a lot of cultural significance and differentiators there, but uniformly it's a human experience. People are suffering traumatic losses, and we have to make something, something by way of resolution for them out of an imperfect resolution medium, which is money. So that's the difficulty of the job that we have to do. I hope that responds to your question, Adoli.
Yeah. You know, Adoli, Joe, you're one of those privileged and lawyers who had the honor of attending McGill University, and globally there are only 2 as such aviation law schools. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, and then IAWA, for example, most of our members are for the most part lawyers, but not necessarily who have gone through the aviation law school of McGill or Leiden, the other one in Netherlands. But then on top of Iowa, I work for Airlines for America that does a lot of, well, not litigation, but we're kind of trade association representing the top 10 airlines in the US. And we work with the FAA in a lot of legal forms, but none of my colleagues, for example, have been to these prestigious schools. So how do you advise, especially these students, for them to feel like it's not only law, but without having to go to these aviation law schools, you can still get into aviation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is the interesting thing. I started practice as an aviation lawyer before I went to McGill and had 2 years of legal experience in litigation before I did my studies. I always wanted to specialize, I have to say. So back when I was in law school, I saw other students go down the path that law students tend to take. You do the applications, you do internships, you do vacation clerkships and programs like that, and you're always in a competitive group of students seeking the very limited places to do that sort of thing. I said, that's not for me. Aviation is for me. I'm going to take that path, come hell or high water, whatever. I was going to do that because that was where my interest is. So my advice for students would be, whether or not they choose to take postgraduate specialist aviation programs like at Leiden University or McGill, which is my alma mater, which I'm very proud of, what you need to do is just demonstrate your passion by getting involved. And for me, before I went to McGill, that meant taking my reading and my interest and putting my thought process around it and writing. And so I sought to publish short articles in student publications while I was at law school and in aviation legal newsletters and things like that, just to really give some substance to my thinking and my interest. And really the great thing about putting that work in is that it's never wasted. You not only learn something for yourself by way of research, but you can help other people. And even lawyers working in the fields or in the agencies and law firms that you'd like to work for, they do research and they Google and they will find efforts by student writers and new practitioners in that field and use it. And other people may find it as well, like journalists who are looking for experts in a particular area or people who have at least engaged with a specific niche subject. So for me, when I was at law school, because I was studying both psychology and law, I was very interested in post-traumatic stress disorder and neuropsychology and psychopathology. So I wanted to understand how trauma that was experienced came to have organic manifestations in the brain. And I applied that to aviation law, which interestingly enough, if you are in an air accident and don't have a bodily physical injury or tangible injury, means you cannot be compensated for the mental trauma that you may have experienced. So to me, that seemed really unfair and really difficult to understand. And it sent me through a rabbit hole of research about international conventions and how different countries viewed how aviation law should compensate individuals in exchange for an airline capping the compensation it has to pay to an individual, and medical science. And to me, it was fascinating. It's a question that is still evolving in the law, and it's been some 15, 16 years since I first engaged with it. And from time to time, cases will come up and issues that I deal with will engage with those issues. So this is something I hit upon and was interested in as an undergraduate law student, and still has relevance to my practice and to the broader aviation community. So my encouraging words to students who don't have the opportunity perhaps to do a specialized aviation legal program or want to work in aviation law without that specialization would be to just find out what really is driving your interest and then pursue it. And by pursue it, I mean read, research, and write. just really see what is in you, and you do have a great contribution to make. You may not think you have sufficient training or experience to make that contribution, but your view is important because it's yours. It's an individual view, and it's your individual perspective and experience brought to what may be a novel problem that no one else has been able to see in your way. And your way may be the way that helps a broader group of people, and it may be what's needed. So you really need to just feel free to experiment with your interest and pursue it as far as it feels comfortable to do within your time and within your other responsibilities. So for me, it's never been wasted, and I'd highly encourage people to do that sort of research and writing.
That's really great. So I hope students especially will have a great takeaway from this and put it to practice.
And if you are thinking of various ideas around aviation or have specific interests, like you want to work in a department of the FAA or DOT, or in other countries, other regulators, or other particular areas of law that are, sort of handled by private law firms, I'm more than willing to give you my 2 cents and my experience on what may assist in that regard for a new practitioner or a student, including topics of interest in aviation law and policy going forward that really could use a passionate individual who wants to read and research and write something, but people may not know what's really of interest out there. More than happy to informally chat with people about that sort of thing and help them explore their interests.
Great. And Marita is here. I see you, Marita. Marita is our board member as well for IAWA. She's the VP of Europe and Africa for IAWA. And I see her. I'm sure you have a question, Marita. You're on mute.
Thanks a lot. It's very interesting. You have a global approach and you work globally with the stakeholders. Do you feel there are different approaches looking from a different continents on all your cases, or with your stakeholders, also with your clients? So you say if you deal, for example, with Australians or with US, or you mentioned also the Malaysian accidents, etc. Do you need different approaches, or it's always the same one from a legal approach?
Thanks, Marita. It's a very good question. And I see the unifying human and emotional elements across everyone, but there are very distinct approaches to the cultural backgrounds of people that I have to deal with. Absolutely important to be sensitive and alive to those differences. I mean, if you think about legal approaches, anyone can learn them. They're not rocket science. But the approach to people that I've had to cultivate has been the most challenging thing in my practice, being international. So I would go from having to speak to African people in London to speaking to Russian people in Russia to speaking to American people in America. And all of them have very different approaches and see different significance in different elements of what I can do and what I advise on. And as I said, it's a difficult skill to cultivate, is to absorb what their driving interest is to help guide what I do in a way that has value for them. That's an important skill to cultivate. The other thing is, as a very practical matter, I grew up as a first-generation Indian born in Australia, and my parents have very strong Indian accents. Almost no one can understand them apart from me. So what I learned very early on was the importance of, I don't want to toot my own horn for the way I speak, but trying to slowly measure my speech so that people in English can understand me whereas they may not have understood an Aussie accent, an Australian accent, or something like that. And I've discovered in myself an ability to try and listen a bit better through other people's accents, to really hear them when others can't or won't, because they're trying to see things through their own eyes too much. So the quality of empathy, I think, and really trying to see things from someone else's perspective, really important for a practitioner doing what I do. But I think anyone that has to cross borders in giving advice and taking instructions from people from around the world, you really have to suspend your own way of thinking as best you can to understand the problem you're facing for someone else. So yeah, I think those cross-cultural approaches and the different way different people think is something you have to be very alive to in my field.
Thank you. It was just great. I need to write it down now. You have to suspend your own thinking for the moment of this process. This is a very great one. So no, yes, thanks. Thanks. And I agree, working also multicultural, about the importance, but you described it. That's really great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
really great. I mean, the good thing is this session is recorded, and we're going to share that with you, because on top of his presentation, all these wisdom that he shared with us is really something to take home for everybody, especially for those that are just getting into the industry. It's not about the profession, but the empathy that comes with it. And I'm sure the psychology course must have done its job as well, but even your personality is so calming, and you're the perfect fit to be dealing with these people, lost family members. So you have the overall package, and that's something to, in the professional world, in this global world, to aspire to. So really, Joe, overall, I'm really impressed and happy that you came here to share with the group your experience.
Thank you, Sophie. That's very kind of you to say. Yeah, it's an interesting role that I have to play, an important role in many respects for families we have to work with. But really, it's, in a way, we compare ourselves to doctors as part of different professions. One of their rules is first do no harm. And there is a lot of harm a lawyer can do if they don't listen to their client. And we want to make sure that preventable problem is addressed. So listening is very key to what we do. And people that work with us, our staff, interns, consultants, colleagues overseas, they come to learn very quickly that we'll get to a better resolution if everyone listens to everyone else.
Oh, that's great. So, do you have any more questions? Let me see if there's anything on the chat. Yeah. Any closing remarks?
Closing remarks? No. As you can probably tell, this is an area I'm very passionate about. Yes. I like helping people in the aviation space, and I like the fact that the work that we do can help improve aviation for everyone involved. I mean, sometimes that's by arguing in court. Sometimes that's just by lending support to people who have been wronged. But in every circumstance, there is something we can do to leave the system better than we found it. So, yeah, I think there's a question.
Well, I think Susie has a question.
Yes, I do have a question. It's been great listening to you, Joe. And I've picked up a few things about the aviation industry that I didn't know before. So my question is, how would you describe your success rate in mediation in the aviation industry? Yeah, thanks.
Success rate, thanks for the question. Do you mean in terms of winning or losing cases, or qualitatively in terms of our goal of making aviation safety? Can I just clarify?
Okay, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So qualitatively in terms of output, in terms of aviation safety, in terms of client appreciation, and then quantitatively in terms of the numbers and the statistics. How many, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the easier one first, the quantitative one, which is in one litigated case in my 6 years of this firm's practice, my client came second. And there's only 2 in that race in a litigated case. So that was a medical case for an elderly gentleman pilot. So our success rate through negotiating resolutions and through litigation is unparalleled in this space. We tend to take on the best cases that we know we can assist with and will make a difference. And it's that making a difference, which is the qualitative aspect I think you're talking about.
Yes.
And that is partially litigation, but it's also partially other work that we do. So my work on the Commercial Drone Association, which is voluntary, my work on the HIMSS Australia Advisory Group, which is also voluntary, and the work with IALPG, which thirdly is voluntary, probably has made the greatest impact overall for the most number of stakeholders. So here we're talking about commercial drone operators who didn't really have a good connection with aviators or professional aviators until I connected them with Australian pilot unions. Then we have the group of addicted pilots who were needing legal assistance and needing a program like the American HIMSS system to enable them to continue flying once their health issues were dealt with. That's made an impact on those pilots and their families. And we've had pilots go through this program who were near to losing their life, but now are successful aviation business owners and doing the roles that I, for example, once did in terms of helping other addicted pilots. So that I see as a huge success. And thirdly, with IALPG, doing what we did on a local scale in Australia at the international level and getting international airline pilots to engage with commercial drone operators and remote pilots to think proactively about the future of aviation regulation, I think leaves something of a lasting legacy. Obviously, there's a lot more to be done and a lot more can be done at a more global level like that. But the great thing is you open doors to conversations, and these conversations lead to real understanding between diverse stakeholders. And I'm really proud to have been part of opening some doors in those circumstances to help make aviation better, both at a local level with individuals and their families, with their health, for example, and at a more global level when we're talking about organizations and associations and their members and how they look at the new aviation entrants like remote pilots coming into their world and how they work together. So it's tough to measure these things, and I hope I've described it in a way that makes sense. But I think qualitatively, we see success every day, incrementally, by having more conversations, more relationships, and opening doors between diverse stakeholder groups. And I think the more communication there is, the safer aviation is.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not sure if there are any more questions, but as I said, I'm more than happy to chat with anyone who'd like to take any aspect of this further offline. More than happy to get in touch by email, but yeah, that's all I really have to say.
Okay, Joe, we really appreciate it. And before we go, I'd like to tell you of other upcoming IAWA events that we have. For those that are new, we do have these virtual networking sessions every other week on mostly Thursdays at this time. But in May, it's going to be a busy month. We are going to have events almost every week. And like, for example, the next upcoming one is going to be May 6th. It's going to be coming out of COVID. Before we had different sessions on how we're coping during COVID, how the industry as a whole has been affected by COVID and what what is it doing to us and what are we doing to overcome it? But now we're at that stage, we're almost coming out of COVID. So how are we prepared to transition to balance and everything? So we have one session. In fact, it's going to be 2 different sessions in the coming month. We're going to have another event on a sustainable future of aviation, and then communication with influence in a world of change. And of course, as Bobby, our president, mentioned at the beginning, we're having in October our 33rd annual conference in Charleston, and it's going to be virtual and a limited in-person meeting as well. But in between, we don't have the June whole schedule yet, but June, July, August, we'll continue to have these virtual sessions. And please look at us at iowa.org and look at the event section to see the upcoming events. And really, we're honored. Adole, I really appreciate you connecting us with Joe. Joe was an excellent presentation, and I hope to have you back in other sessions as well. And our attendees, please feel free to connect with Joe. He has a lot of resources. If not internship with him, you've seen it. He can guide you in your ambition to get into the aviation industry, be it low and others connected in the pilot world, in the drone world, in everything through his close relationship with the global aviation entities. So please, these are the opportunities where we connect and create opportunities for you and take advantage of that. And with that, thanks for taking the time to attend. And Joe, thank you for an excellent session, and we'll definitely keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.